So, all right. Excellent. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start with the acknowledgement of country. And I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting, and pay respect to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present. I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander peoples in attendance today. And feel free to please put where you pay your respects to in the chat, and as people are joining. And we'd also like to, if we can, just get an idea of maybe what your role is and your name. So maybe put your name, your role, and your location, and if you know it, your the country you pay respects to. Oh, Andrew, that came through as a direct message.
Oh, that's because
that's because it was set before. Yeah, sorry about that.
I'll see if I can fix it.
Okay, welcome everyone. Give you a few more minutes. If you haven't already got a link to the agenda document, I'll put that in there as well. That's how we're following through with everyone today. And it's actually got all the other links in there as well. So if I do stop putting them into the chat, you can actually put them into then. How many people have we got? Give them a few more minutes. If you please put any of your questions in that Easy Retro doc. If you don't know who I'm Bree Norton. I'm co-chair with Amanda Mace here today of OZeWAI, the not-for-profit for accessible digital accessibility professionals. And we've been progressing our membership approach at the moment. And one of the things that came with discussions with our committee was that we haven't done any kind of online discussion for a while, and we needed to do it. So we thought, well, while we're waiting for our web platform to be set up properly, we were going to be using the web directions platform. We thought we'd just run some through Zoom. So that's why we're here today. Thank you for joining us. Now, I think what we might do is actually just go to our three speakers. If you'd like to do a quick intro of yourself as well, just separately. So we might go to Andrew Downie first, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then we'll finish with you, Amanda, and you can get started. Andrew, are you happy to?
You want to start with me? Sorry.
Yes, yeah. And then we'll go to Ricky and then Ross.
Hello, my name is Andrew Downie. I'm a psychologist by training and inclination, and somehow I got sidetracked into all this webby stuff. So I have no formal qualifications in web design or scripting and such, but I have had the huge benefit of working with some really talented people over the past 20 odd years. And so I've got a fair bit of knowledge of technology for people with disabilities generally, and with the online material generally. I am totally blind and use a screen reader, which is very helpful when I'm testing websites for the nasties. Yeah, and I think that'll be enough.
Ricky, that sounds like it's your turn to go.
I'm Ricky Onsman, and my experience is almost the opposite of Andrew Downie, in that I started out as a writer and information officer for various organisations. Then I became an editor at various places like SitePoint and US Australia and Web Directions. And then I became a designer, a web designer myself. And I kind of, from the start, always assumed that websites should be accessible, which after 20 years turns out makes me quite experienced in web accessibility. And now I'm a technical content writer at TPGI, an American company, where I write guidance for our team of 100 accessibility auditors and engineers, telling them how to assess websites for accessibility.
Thanks, Ricky. Ross, you want to give yourself a bit of an intro?
Thanks, Amanda, and hi everyone. I'm Ross. I'm the director of CANAXESS, a web accessibility agency based in Canberra. My background is of a developer, so I formerly get back in to C#, moving into JavaScript, and then over time I've moved in to a web accessibility role, and I was recognizing more and more that as I'm doing a lot more of web accessibility work, I was liking it more, and I started going down a rabbit hole of learning more and understanding more. So what I'm finding now, the more I read, the more I feel like I don't know and I need to read more. So becoming experienced means that I'm always wondering, is there something more I need to understand?
Thanks, Ross. So I guess I'll end with me. So my name's Amanda Mace, and as Bree started with the very beginning, I am co-chair of OZeWAI with Bree Norton. I kind of fell into that role too, just like I did at AbleDocs in my everyday job as vice president of AbleDocs, which is an accessibility firm with head offices in Canada. So like Ricky, I hold the fort down for Australia with my team here for an international organization. And we're really lucky to have all three of these gentlemen on the call with us. They're all really well experienced and all coming from very different angles. And I think I want to start the questions with just, digital accessibility has such a big umbrella. In fact, Ross, you just alluded to it in your intro, is once you start, there's how long is a piece of string? So I'm curious, I'm going to start with you, Ross, just because really you led into my first question, and that's how do you get someone to start understanding accessibility? Where do they begin?
That's a real but difficult one. I guess understanding what the bare minimum is. So everyone always talks about WCAG as this benchmark which we must reach, but often that's the absolute minimum. So it's that entry level toe in the water. What is it someone needs to do as an absolute minimum to make their website or app accessible, and that's apply WCAG. So often individuals and the teams think this is all I need to do to make something accessible, and that's I guess the bare minimum. And then from that you can then build upon that, saying, well, you've done this to satisfy a compliance, but more and more it's not just a compliance exercise, it's making it better for the user. So often you could use other levers of motivating a team, saying no one wants to make bad software. So if you're happy making something average, making something which isn't necessarily usable, I keep doing what you're doing. But more and more, I would imagine a really big motivator is appealing to developers a sense of professionalism, saying you need to build it in a way which more and more users can use and navigate and operate it. So for understanding it, it's understanding the bare minimum, but emphasizing that that bare minimum is just that, it's the basic level, and saying once you've hit that benchmark, look at making it useful for testing with users. So there's not really one easy answer other than look for the easy in, which is emphasizing WCAG, and then based upon that, look at expanding out and appealing to a team's professionalism, saying, well, you've made it technically accessible, but there's still issues attached. So look at doing a bit more. So that's what I would say.
Fair enough. Ricky, with your experience in the industry and being part of TPGI, which is a massive firm if people don't know, and does an awful lot of great work, where do you see people coming in? Like when they're coming in and they're contacting, Where are they starting on their journey?
Well, at TPGI, it's a vast range of experience of people who end up there. But it's fair to say that they're probably divided into two main camps, which is people who have an abiding interest in digital, the digital world as such, and have, for one reason or another, developed an interest in accessibility for people with disability. And the other side is people who have a personal experience of disability and want to use that as the basis for increasing understanding of their needs and people like them in terms of the digital world. And I guess that's something that I would probably add to Ross's answer as well, is that certainly what I found as I went along is that I had to gain an understanding of what disability is and the impact that it has on people in the digital world. And I think that is increasing. We're getting better, but there are still a lot of barriers in the digital world that are based just on ignorance of what people with disability actually have to go through. And when you consider that so much of the digital world is becoming absolutely critical in everybody's lives, financial, legal, medical, all kinds of stuff, it becomes really important to ensure it's not just an edge case add-on to make things accessible. It's a need that goes right from the start. And I think at TPGI, there is an understanding that that is how we assess other people's websites. We're mostly people who have some experience in building websites ourselves. And to some extent, we're a bit shocked that, so much of the digital world is inaccessible. So, there's a lot of people who work at TPGI because we want to change the world.
Love that. There's a concept that is part of my faith, which is called Tikkun Olam, which is basically loosely translated as healing the world. And I like to think that part of the industry is about healing the world a little bit. Andrew, I'm curious from your point of view, when you're introducing someone or they're asking about understanding accessibility, and I could be wrong here, but do you take that impact on user quite personally, like this is the impact on user, and do you start there, or where do you start if not there?
I'm not sure I take it personally. I've often said that it is probably, if you want to exclude a group of people, people who have no vision and use screen readers, they're probably the easiest group to knock out. That said, and I noticed there was a comment in the chat a little while ago about people with cognitive disabilities, and it's really important to note, I'll get back to what I was saying, that there are far more people who access the internet who have some sort of cognitive problem than there are people who use screen readers. So although it's easy to make a website inaccessible to someone with a screen reader, and it's fairly easy to demonstrate that. So if I turn the screen reader on and start navigating the website that you've spent hours making look beautiful, and you find that I can't find half the content on it, it's frustrating for me and embarrassing for you. So that demonstrates fairly easily what's gone wrong. And the reason it's gone wrong, and I'll just digress slightly or a lot, is that a lot of the material that's developed these days is not using semantic HTML code. If everyone stuck to using semantic HTML code with proper CSS and proper JavaScript, and I'll say a bit more about JavaScript in a minute, then we wouldn't have all these issues. It's because people write stuff that initially looks good to them, that it doesn't work with the screen reader. Having said that, if we go to people who have cognitive disabilities, their needs aren't that dissimilar to mine in that they need nice, clear pages that aren't cluttered and don't have all sorts of distractions and have stuff bundled on top of each other and so forth. So So I don't take it personally, although sometimes I do. I suppose I do sometimes. If I'm trying to find something on a web page and it's a real mess, then I do get grumpy about it. I just to pick up on something I started to say a little while ago. When we had static web pages, it was really pretty straightforward to make stuff accessible. Once we start having interactive pages, then we start using scripting, and that's where things can come unstuck if you don't get it right. I had persuaded myself up until about 8 years ago that I couldn't learn JavaScript. I've done other scripting, but I couldn't write JavaScript. And I was working for an educational organisation, and people kept coming to me to ask me, is this quiz accessible to screen reader users, educational quizzes? And they weren't. And I thought, well, I'd better write some samples to at least demonstrate that it is possible. So that's how I started writing JavaScript, which is very useful because I can now write something and see if it works with the screen reader, and it doesn't always, and that's something just to be aware of. So I've jumped all over the place.
No, that's okay. I love it. I actually think you touched on something, and weirdly, I saw it pop up in the Easy Retro board just as I was thinking it is, and I'm curious for thoughts now because I have very strong opinions about the new WCAG getting rid of 411, the parsing, which has been a debated topic at W3C, and it might be too technical a conversation to have today, but I'm curious of opinion. So I'm actually going to jump to that question. Bree, I know you're trying to organize them for me, but I'm going to jump to it. I'm curious, in just a sentence or two, how you feel, each of you feel about the removal of parsing, which requires, well, some parts of HTML to be validated via validator, where it affects accessibility. Andrew, 1 or 2 sentences. Are you in agreement with the removal of 411?
I don't know what it means.
Okay, no, that's totally fair. And like I said, it might be a very technical question. Ross, do you have an opinion?
I do. I'm sitting on the fence a bit. On the one hand, I don't think invalid HTML affects a browser or assistive technology much. Equally, though, I would also feel making HTML valid would benefit accessibility. So I can see both approaches, where ultimately I don't think it matters much, but equally it might matter a bit. So I'm not sure if I've answered that or whether I just sat on the fence.
How do you feel about the removal of the parsing success criteria?
I find it pretty frustrating, to be honest. Look, I can understand the basis on which the decision was made that, you know, modern browsers fill in a lot of the end tags and that kind of stuff for that people leave out. But I don't actually think that's a good thing. I don't think browsers should be doing that. I think
it's a really bad thing.
Correct semantic markup in the first place. And, you know, at TPGI, we acknowledge the reasoning behind it and we accept it. But what we do is we still pick up the same issues. We just file them under different success criteria.
And that's sort of been the approach. I have to admit that AbleDocs is doing the same, that they'll fit under other success criteria. So really what's interesting to me, and I'm glad, Ricky, that you and I are on the same page about this, and Ross as well, is that I have always been taught that you don't create new technologies, assistive or otherwise, based off of rubbish code. And if you're going to give us alphabet soup, then maybe it works today, but it might not work tomorrow. I also think there's an assumption. I actually recently wrote a blog about 2.2, and I worry about our assumption around the assistive technologies that are now parsing the code via the browsers. Are we assuming that everyone is updating their assistive technology? And that may be because the people involved, and this includes myself, in the working groups are pretty centric to North American and European markets. Are we making the wrong assumptions around assistive technology relying on browsers to parse our code? Which is, like I said, a very technical discussion. We won't get into it here, but definitely something to take offline one day for a fun discussion about coding. Andrew, you want to add something to that?
Yes, now that I know the background, I've said for a long while that one of the problems, one of the reasons that so much stuff becomes inaccessible is because the browsers bend over backwards to render stuff that they shouldn't. In my most grumpy moods, I'll say, if someone doesn't escape an ampersand, then the browser should just reject the whole page and throw it out. Now, some people think that's a bit extreme, but if people were forced to write correct semantic code, and all of the browsers just threw it out, then they would write proper code.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the question always is the cat too far out of the bag for that one? To be perfectly honest, with the types of frameworks that we have that we're currently building websites from. But again, this could get very quickly into a very long technical conversation. So I want to bring it back just a little bit. We're always, or at least I ask clients who are new to accessibility, they're always asking for quick wins, and they need quick wins. You need to be able to reward yourself, pat yourself on the back through the journey, because accessibility is a journey, and a long one at that, as we sort of touched on at the very top. I'm curious, and maybe Ricky, we'll start with you. What's the one thing you tell someone if they have to start somewhere in terms of fixing something? What do you tell them to fix? What's your go-to low-hanging fruit?
Well, apart from semantic markup.
Yeah, apart from semantic markup.
that would be the starting point for me. But beyond that, I think probably the thing that stands out the most and that contributes the most to the inaccessibility of so many websites is not only not providing, but not understanding what to provide in alternative text to images. Really, it shouldn't be difficult. It's about providing an equivalent experience, and so many people don't understand the need for it, nor how to implement it. And yet it's not a terribly complicated thing. And that would change the web overnight if everybody wrote decent alt text.
Ross, how about you? Do you agree with the alt text call?
I do, yes. So one thing I've experienced a lot of is individuals adding over verbose alt text, so adding the descriptions of an image which might not be necessary, or it's decorative only. So emphasizing that whilst all images need an alt attribute, not all images need alt text, and it's that nuance of what image needs a description versus what image needs no description, and also there's that a further nuance of, if you are providing a description, how verbose should it be? Should it be one word, multiple words, a sentence? There's a lack of understanding, I guess, of how much is enough, where often teams write a huge amount of alt text, which is not necessarily helpful. So alt text is my number one to go to.
Andrew, what's good alt text?
Ricky said it's simple. I'm not quite sure that it is that simple. I mean, the old adage that a picture tells picture's worth 1,000 words is often true, and it can be difficult to convey in words what an image does. One of the, I read this from a guy quite some years ago, and his comment was, the alt text should be meaningful in the context in which the image is used. And I think if you think about that as you're choosing an image, if you think, why am I putting this image on the page, that will help you to write useful and meaningful alt text. So if it's just there to break up the text, then just, as Ross said, stick a null alt on it, because it's not much use to me if it just says this is a decorative image, or this is a picture of a tree or something.
That's perfect.
It doesn't, yeah, it doesn't add much. But I mean, we could debate this, we could have a whole session on what is useful alt text, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We absolutely could. Well, I'll throw a spanner in the works because I can. Okay, alt text. Does ARIA help? How useful is ARIA? So for those who don't know, ARIA is essentially, I'll describe it rather than define it, but it's essentially code that speaks directly to assistive technologies, and it overrides the natural semantic. So it overrides the HTML, which means it is equally helpful and dangerous at the same time. Ross, how do you feel about ARIA? Is it helpful? I've seen ARIA used for things like alt text.
I found it's hugely helpful when it's used appropriately, but I've seen many instances where complex elements are made up with ARIA attributes used everywhere, which renders the interaction unusable. So whilst there's a place for ARIA and an ARIA-based complex controls, often there's a lack of understanding of how it works and how it works over multiple browsers and assistive technologies. So using ARIA right is one thing, but then making sure that all of that behavior works well in JAWS, NVDA, or Firefox. So making it work well is one thing, but then making sure the compatibility works over all the browsers is another thing. So it's useful, but it's like a double-edged sword. It needs to be used appropriately, and I don't necessarily think there's that understanding at times of what is appropriate.
Fair enough. Ricky, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. Look, the whole idea of ARIA in the first place was to make up for shortcomings in HTML. But by the time we had HTML5 come along and become the standard, most of that ARIA achieved is achievable with semantic markup. It is still useful, but I think a good indication of the risks of it, and this is getting in a whole other area of quicksand, is if you ask an AI to make something accessible, it'll stick ARIA labels on everything. And that itself is an indication of how ingrained the use of ARIA has been as a substitute for best practice markup. And it's frankly, it's less helpful than it should be.
So there's a quick story. A few years ago, I want to say it was 2016 or 2017, at an OZeWAI conference, I presented making the case for ARIA, and it was actually directly based off of a conversation I'd had the previous year at OZeWAI around ARIA. And on the way back, I think maybe it was 20. What year were we in Canberra? It was a year we were in Canberra, because I remember we were walking from the conference center to the hotel, having a conversation with a group of people. I won't name who, but someone in that group said we should have never published ARIA. All it's ever done is create us headaches. And I'm like, no. This is on us as accessibility advocates to educate better, so it's used better. And probably a year later, Andrew, I don't know if you remember this, but you and I sat down. I was having trouble with an ARIA label that was NVDA just wasn't, it was reading space in the middle of it. Right. It turned out that it was the ARIA label can only be so long before NVDA on Firefox will start announcing random blank spaces in the middle of it, just in case you're curious. Do you remember that, Andrew?
I do, yes.
Yeah. It was the power of crowdsourcing that day. We must have had 6 people around the table trying to figure out why this ARIA label was randomly reading blank spaces in the middle of it.
Bree mentioned in the chat, yeah, the first rule of ARIA is do not use ARIA when a native HTML element will suffice. I did a paper at an OZeWAI conference, and I've forgotten the title, but it was something like ARIA for good or evil or something. my favorite ARIA attribute is ARIA live equals polite. Now, what that does, if something changes on the screen, then, and I need to know about it with the screen reader, then if you have that attribute on that element, then the screen reader will speak it. There's a ARIA live equals assertive, which means it interrupts everything. And the other one that people completely overuse is role equals alert. So the screen reader will say alert, and it will just interrupt everything else when something happens. And people use that. I even came across it once on an empty div, which was fascinating.
Of course. Why wouldn't you?
So it can be a really, really valuable tool. Whoever invented this thing called menu item, I'll have terse words if I ever meet them. Everyone does it, including Microsoft, and I suspect Apple. They put menu and menu item onto navigation items, and it shouldn't be there. It's complete misuse. So the screen reader, before every item in a navigation list, it'll say menu item, delete, menu item, delete. And one of the screen readers sometimes won't even activate the link because that's wrong. I've actually in the exceptions dictionary on my screen reader, if for menu item, it just won't say it at all now. I got so fed up with it saying it.
There's a great book called Inclusive Components, which actually delves into that exact topic. I was just rereading it the other day to give some advice to a client, actually, because I remember it being in there. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
It is a misuse. People do not understand.
Yeah, I mean, there's some lovely uses. I mean, if you're doing a modal dialogue, and we're getting all geeky now, but if you want to write an accessible modal dialogue, then there are some ARIA attributes and roles that can be really, really helpful to make that work really nicely. So yeah, it can be most helpful. But I do get amused when I come across a really, really badly written page and it's got this ARIA sprayed all through it. And I think it was Ricky that said, people are trying to patch up real bad code by sort of putting ARIA on it. Yeah. Okay, I think we've said enough about ARIA.
Yeah, I think we have. I think we could have this conversation much longer than we have planned for today. Look, there's a really good one. One of the questions here that was in the Easy Retro board, and please keep adding questions in there. We'll get to all of them. We'll attempt to get to all of them. But one of them was that many people in the industry are also advocates with lived experience of disability. How should we support our peers to reduce burnout? And Andrew, I'd like to start with you on this one.
I'm not. I'd never thought about getting burned out. In fact, I was supposed to retire from work about 5 years ago, and after about 3 weeks, I was bored and I started another job. And I'm only working 1 day a week, getting paid. But I mean, the reason I'm sitting here is because I enjoy this stuff, and I, as Ross touched on earlier, we keep learning. So for me, it's not. I don't really relate to the burnout question. I suppose I've always been able to pace myself reasonably well, and I think that's important. So being aware if I need a rest and so forth. But I'm one of those idiots who will just sit here and play with JavaScript for hours just because, if I want something to work, I'll make it work. Sorry, I was being distracted by the chat.
No, that's okay.
But there is the risk, of course, that you're going to call on the same pool of people, and I suspect that's where the question's coming from. So yeah, don't overstretch the friendship, I suppose. But as I say, yeah, for me, it's not something that I find tedious or uncomfortable.
Do we worry about burnout? And Ross or Ricky, either of you have both been in the industry a long time, much like me. Do we worry about burnout in that advocacy area in general? Accessibility gets a lot of pushback and not a lot of prioritization.
I'll jump in there. I think one of the things that certainly influences the way I approach it, and I can see that there are definitely times when I get really tired of banging my head against the brick wall. I just cannot believe how little progress we've actually made for all the time and effort we've put in. But I think one of the things there is that to put it in the perspective of who we're doing this stuff for and why. And, you know, it comes back again to that business that it's not about an edge case mentality. It's not about, you know, a small minority of people. What we're trying to do is make the web and apps accessible to everybody. And that kind of, once you kind of look at it in that light, it makes it easier on a day-to-day basis to say that, you know, yes, a lot of the people who are active in this area are advocates because of personal experience. But the reality is we should all be advocates for accessibility. And once you start to look at it that way, then it's kind of, you know, it's a matter of you're working with other people to achieve something for the whole world.
Absolutely. Ross, anything to add to that?
One of the main things which I found is over the time accepting what I view as a minimum level of accessibility. I guess basically becoming more and more accepting of people wanting to do the very best, but not necessarily reaching that end goal of 100% accessibility. So recognizing people don't necessarily want to make a bad digital experience, but there might be other influences at play. There might be time, there might be money, there might be infrastructure, all are pulling on that digital accessibility, where something which is being implemented might not have really a good accessibility. And I guess over time I've become a bit more accepting of letting through or acknowledging the defects where it might mean I'm losing a battle but winning a war. Is me looking past a few minor defects helping at the end goal of making an app or a website more accessible or not? So that's often something I've had a difficulty accepting, where I want something to be 100% accessible, but I realise if I always strive for that goal, I'll often end up being deeply disappointed. So over time, I've accepted, disappointingly, I guess, that we all want to make things accessible, but sometimes the best of intentions mean that we're delivering something not accessible, and so that sits poorly with me. But I recognise sometimes there's factors outside of my control which I can't influence, and in that instance, it's what am I happy accepting? What's my bare minimum?
One of my favourite quotes was from a psychologist when I was doing the reading for my honours year, and he said, and we're off topic, he said, striving for perfection is the best way to achieve self-destruction. And I have to keep reminding myself of that, because I, like Ross, I get very cross if things aren't absolutely spot on. So I think another way of putting it is the art of the possible. So yeah, we may not get it to the point where we have it absolutely right, but at least if we know that we've done our best with it. That's important. But just going back to Ricky's comment about who are we working for, and the answer is everyone. And one of my concerns is that we keep talking about accessibility when and that makes people think, well, we're doing the charitable thing, we're making it accessible to these people with disabilities. When we, if we could put more emphasis on doing it correctly, I think that's a much better way of focusing what we're trying to get people to achieve. We're not trying to build something, we're not trying to do extra work to make it accessible. We're trying to do the thing properly in the first place so that it works for everyone.
So that kind of leads into my next question. And it starts again with that baseline of WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So most people have a pet peeve where WCAG doesn't go far enough. And this was a question straight out of the Easy Retro board. So if WCAG doesn't go far enough, I suppose that probably underlines a lot of people. Doesn't go far enough. It's not really about impact on users. It's a bit of a checklist, whatever. That aside, what's your next biggest pet peeve from an accessibility point of view? So Andrew, why don't you go first?
Sorry, next biggest which? I missed that word.
Pet peeve. So the thing that bugs you the most, your bugbear.
Right. I suppose my biggest bugbear would be unclear navigation. I'm trying to find something on a site, and it should be straightforward, and I can go around it. Several years ago, my son and I were going to, we were booking an airplane flight. Now, my son is not blind; he's perfectly capable individual, and we spent ages going through this wretched website, and I won't name the Australian airline. Oh, I just did. And we eventually got it all sorted out. And I said, oh, by the way, what terminal does it go from? 15 minutes later, we're still trying to, that's the sort of thing that really irritates me. Stuff that should be right there in front of us. You just have to go hunting, and will it be this link? Will it be that link? And it's buried, and it really irks me. In fact, sometimes my son will say to me, he said, "Oh, look, don't bother trying to use that site. I can't work it out. You'll have no show." And he's usually right. Yeah.
Ross, what about you? What's your biggest bugbear or pet peeve?
Mine is success. WCAG is hard to understand, where the tests are written in such a confusing way that one individual might interpret it one way, where another individual interprets it another way, which means, I guess, if there's multiple levels of interpretation, who's right and who's wrong. And I know that in the accessibility community, there's lots of prominent voices who are put over an approach, but that's not always the right approach. So my biggest thing is that the testing at WCAG is hard to understand. It's hard extracting what the intent actually is of each of the tests. It's hard to work out what we need to test for. What does the test to look like? What is the result? That's my biggest bugbear, the ambiguity of around the testing.
Fair enough. Ricky?
I'm going to go a little bit bigger picture, and I'm glad you mentioned WCAG in this, because I've just finished writing a blog post about the latest version of the WCAG 3 working draft. And I think they're really onto something, that they're trying to address some of the failures in WCAG 2 that inhibit us implementing full accessibility. One of those is that you run a bunch of tests, and this is what Ross alluded to as well, and that you come to a point where you tick that you've succeeded and you pass the success criteria, and then you stop. And WCAG 3, one of the principles of WCAG 3 is that it's not a stop-start thing. It's a continuous assessment of accessibility. The job of creating accessibility and maintaining it never ends. And once you get to grips with that, it becomes actually much more possible to do that. And part of that as well, again, as Ross alluded to, is to make allowances. And that's built into WCAG 3 as well, that you're not going to have 100% of everything all the time. And we need to find ways to allow for that. And the third kind of element of that is that it's got to reflect actual experience. So a lot of what WCAG is built on is almost like theoretical, when it's what WCAG 3 is trying to get at is to test with real people. That it's not just a matter of expert auditors saying this passes or fails, but you actually have people with lived experience using it and saying, yeah, this is on the right track. I can use this. Yeah. So I think that what they're trying to do with WCAG 3, even though it's got a lot of people upset, I think is on the money. And it's trying to address those areas that WCAG 2 stop us achieving.
So WCAG 3 is a whole topic onto its own, but really quickly, I'm curious. We know that the timeline is far down the track. Currently, the focus isn't there yet. The focus is to get 2.2 out the door, and then the AG working group will start turning their attentions to 3. But there is a lot of controversy. There's a lot of work to be done. What's your feel as it stands now around how long it's going to take to make WCAG 3 a thing?
I would say that they're not going to get to anything close to a practical draft for at least 3 to 5 years.
Yeah,
and
that would be my
after
assessment.
Yeah, and then after that, there'll be another transition period of at least 5 years where WCAG 2 is still in effect and people use it as the standard before it changes to WCAG 3 being accepted as the only web standard. And that's going to take, so I think until WCAG 3 becomes the sole standard, a decade.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. As someone who's been a part of the Silver Task Force when we were still in those baby stages to now as part of the AG group, it is a long way off. But I think too, Ricky, you're right that it's promising. And having uncomfortable conversations is not a bad thing in this space. So we have to start getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, I think. And that's speaking as a member of that working group as well. I equally need to. There are so many questions here and we're sort of closing in on the 10 minutes. And I've noticed we've got sort of a document happening on the live document happening on the background that Bree and some of the OZeWAI members have access to. And I'm conscious, Bree, that there are some areas here that we can touch on in separate sessions. Things like neurodiversity, I think it's a whole session onto itself. So thank you for the people who've sent in questions around that. Updates to human rights, the Australian Human Rights Commission is definitely a very important topic that I think we should definitely focus on. But I think a good way to sort of end and close the last sort of 6-7 minutes that we really have here is there's a question here and and I'm not sure, I don't know who put it in, but it says, Andrew, Ross, and Ricky, I'm reasonably new to this line of work to focus on digital accessibility in higher education. Can you tell us about yourselves and your involvements, which we've already done, but more what I really want to hear from you is, do you mind telling us about changes in digital accessibility that you've noticed over time? So all of you have been in the field for a good amount of time. There's been an awful lot of changes that go well beyond WCAG. So Ross, why don't you give us a highlight of some of the changes that you've seen and the patterns you've seen?
one of the big things which I've seen is working in a government and a private industry, where for years and years, I always thought the government was the main innovator with accessibility, as they had to implement it. They had to meet accessibility benchmarks, and based upon that, I thought, wow, a government is a massive exemplar of what can be achieved with a digital accessibility. How wrong I was. When I moved into a private industry, I appreciated that as there's a lot of complexity with dynamic web apps and websites, often that needs to really build upon complex elements using ARIA, modules. All of that interactivity has to be built in and has to be built well. So often government websites, well, the ones which I've seen are pretty much content based, and generally there's not much opportunity of rendering it really inaccessible, because there's not much functionality there. But private industry has more motivators, and the case in point, well-known supermarkets in Australia implementing accessibility now. They're very much at the actual forefront of what can be achieved with digital accessibility. And it's not so much about building the website, but it's making sure everyone on a delivery team understands accessibility. So government seems to be more reactive, whereas private industry seems to be more proactive, where they recognise the value of people with a disability of being able to use the website. A government just feels like it's a ticking box that we need to make it accessible, but with private industry, the ones who I've worked with recognise that there's extra value in bringing on more users with more diverse abilities and making it work for absolutely everyone. So that's been really eye-opening for me, where private industry is very much the innovator, are doing really interesting things in the digital accessibility area, other than the bare minimum.
Ricky, how about you? What are the changes that you've noticed?
Probably for me, it's that the increasing role of digital technology in all our lives has forced a reassessment of disability advocacy, an understanding of what disability is, how many people have a disability and impairment. When I started working in information services, the disability pension was specifically for people who were totally and permanently incapacitated. I think we've moved a long way beyond that and understanding, and realizing that because of the role that digital technology plays in our lives, we have to understand the impact on people with cognitive disability. It's a great example. That wasn't even a consideration back when the web started. We weren't thinking in those terms. And now that so many services exist in the digital world, we are thinking more about those. I wrote a piece for TPGI a little while ago about numbers and making numbers accessible on the web. And the more I dug into it, the more you realize what role numbers play in everybody's lives and how inaccessibly we present them on the web. So I think there's a level there where it's kind of, we have the opportunity through digital accessibility to actually change how we think about people with disability in the whole world. And that's probably the thing that gives me the greatest impetus to keep going.
I love that, Ricky. Thank you. Andrew?
The old adage, knowledge is power. I'm old enough I was around long before computers were a common and garden thing. I had access to a Braille dictionary in the library which was the other end of the building, and it took up half a wall. Now I've got access to dictionaries on the computer. I've got access to so much information that I didn't have access, and ready access. And my interests and hobbies, I can go to websites and find that information. While we grumble that people still write some nasty stuff, by and large, the accessibility is pretty good. I can do my banking, I can do my shopping through the web, and that applies to people with lots of abilities and disabilities. Screen reader technology, including the free NVDA screen reader that I'm using here, have become so much more powerful. And that's partly in cooperation with Microsofts and Apples and so forth. I can pull out my phone like cheers, and I can check when the next train's coming. That sort of stuff is just so empowering. And and I'm digressing, but your whole GPS stuff, not quite as good as it could be, but getting there. So just so much more ready access to information is just so important.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting when we talk about what's coming up, and Bree has told me that this was a 90-minute session, not a 60-minute session, so we still have time. Apologies about that, everyone. But it brings up the question around AI, and there are two ways we can go in this. And Andrew, you know what way I'm going to go eventually, because you're the one who posed the question. But I'll start here. AI, the impact it could have, the impact it currently has. Where do we sit? Ricky?
I think the main thing with AI at the moment is that the data sets that are available for artificial intelligence to come to certain conclusions is way too limited. It's based on average people who don't exist. As a result of which, if you ask an AI at the moment to, show me a picture of an autistic person, it's going to show you a picture of a sad young man hiding in a corner. And it's just completely unrealistic. And it needs to vastly broaden the data set before it actually becomes useful. The risk is that it's becoming immediately used, and that's a very dangerous thing. So it really needs some regulation of some sort, that it doesn't have negative impacts right from the get-go, because that's not going to happen once it's up and running and dominated. So I think it's a thing that really needs careful attention at the moment and limited use until we figure out how to use it properly.
Ross, how about you? How do you feel about AI, where it's at now, and its, hopeful future?
I think there's a place, but as Ricky alluded to, it's in its infancy at the moment, and there's this a push of rolling it out, which will solve accessibility. As I'm sure all of us have seen, the accessibility overlay vendors now are promoting AI as this magical tool which can rapidly solve accessibility. Where it is now, it's very much in its infancy, but perhaps in the next 5 to 10 years, it might be at a point where it can begin identifying accessibility issues, which would help in the remediation of websites. But there's that worry where, whilst you might have an effective tool which works well, there needs to be oversight still. You can't just assume that this tool will rapidly fix everything. So whilst it might have a place, I also think there needs to be a human element there, making sure that what's identified and what's about to be remediated is valid or not. So I think AI has a role of finding and automating more remediation of low-hanging accessibility issues, but I don't think we're at a point yet where it could solve accessibility issues, as there's often a lot of nuance still. So we aren't there yet.
So the most obvious question here is, Andrew, what's your very favorite accessibility overlay? That was said tongue in cheek. I feel like I need to clarify.
Yes, some years ago, I was working where we were using Microsoft SharePoint 2007, so I'm going back a fair way. And a company developed an overlay for to make SharePoint screen reader friendly. And we spent hours on this thing. And we had trouble even getting it to run on this. It was a complete waste of time. So yeah, that was an interesting introduction to overlays. And my suspicion is that if you start off with poor code, then you're going to be most unlikely going to sort the thing out. You may be able to touch up a few things, but probably not, because I just don't think it works like that. So I'm not a fan of overlays. I suspect that it offers false hope to people who have written the site, and someone complains about it. They say, "Oh, good, I'll grab this tool and that'll fix it," and it doesn't. So I'm not aware of any that have been effective. Did you want me to make a comment about AI, by the way?
I do, yes. I just had to cheekily throw in the
you
overlay.
did, yes, okay. I suspect that AI is a word that's being, if it is a word, that's being overused. I think a lot of what people call artificial intelligence is just teaching the computer what rules to follow. It's not thinking like humans think. So I'll say that from the outset. But I think it has huge implications for good and for evil. But let's, as Ricky said, I think we do need some sort of checks and balances. I was in a session a couple of weeks ago, and one of the presenters is someone who is not able to speak due to a major disability. And she is using ChatGPT to help her generate responses quickly. So rather than having to key in into her augmentative communication device quite slowly, this is able to give her a sentence or a paragraph of information very quickly. And I think that has huge implication. There is and I'll talk by examples because I think it makes a bit of sense. There's an app available for phones called Be My Eyes. And the idea is if a blind person, or I suspect anyone who has visual difficulties, whether it's neurological or due to ophthalmological problems, you call up this service and a volunteer answers, and you use the camera of the phone and say, what colour is this shirt, or can you read this document, or something. And it's proved very helpful. I don't use it, but I know people who do, and they found it very helpful. So what they're doing, they've got a beta running at the moment, and I've heard people do some presentations on it, which is very encouraging. So instead of having a human take your call, you put your question into the app, and ChatGPT generates a response. So it might be describe this photograph to me, or describe this scene to me, and then you can ask it for more detail. And it's even at this point is looking extremely promising. to be able to provide people with a whole lot of useful information. And I'm sure there's all sorts of other scenarios where it is going to be a very valuable tool. Yeah, I think that's all I need to say at this stage.
No, that's perfect. And it's interesting because one of the questions that we had was around laws. And I think this is where we have, laws tend to be the last thing to come on board. That's been true for accessibility, unfortunately. And certainly we don't have quite the stick that maybe the Americans do on that side of the world. But equally for AI, we also know that the laws aren't quite there yet. So the Human Rights Commission is doing what they can to provide advisory notes, but the amount of catch up that the government's currently doing, and that's probably globally, to be perfectly honest, versus how fast AI is growing is probably a little bit concerning as well. And
it's a huge live issue in education, which is where I'm working.
Of course.
And well, the uni where I work, I think they're taking a fairly positive, no, a very positive approach to it. We're not trying to tell people you can't. I'm not a fan of this notion that, if something is difficult, let's ban it. And I think that they're working out the parameters under which people can use it and so forth. And I'm quite positive. But yeah, there is this issue that the technology can outstrip the legislators, which is happening in quite a lot of areas.
So I want to take that in terms of rules, laws, how we get better. And there was a question on the Easy Retro board, and I'll read it verbatim and then we can go from there. But it says other countries have stronger laws with clear deadlines, and I'm wondering if that same approach would push more Australian organizations and agencies into building accessible websites, products, and services. We did have the National Transition Strategy and a deadline of 2014. 9 years on, we're still building awareness. And as someone who was mentored by Dr. Vivian Conway, who based her PhD thesis on the National Transition Strategy and its enormous failure when it came to accessibility, I've got a real I've got real feelings about this one, because it's absolutely true. 9 years on, we are still building awareness. Ricky, do you think that if we went more the EU route, or even the American, or maybe the Ontario way, Canada's put some very strong laws in Ontario around accessibility, do you think that would help Australian agencies and organizations to be more accessible faster?
I think it would. And I think Ross put his finger on it earlier when the key is really government. If government services and products are made accessible and feel that they must be made accessible, then the rest of the community will follow suit. But without that, it won't happen. And Australia is the perfect example of that. We were well on the road to it with the 1992 Disability Discrimination Act. And then when at the 2000 Olympics, that was a phenomenal result of a user was able to say, I can't buy tickets, and the Human Rights Commission ruled in his favour. The Sydney Organising Committee was forced to pay a $20,000 fine. Then at the same time, we had cases like a cinema in Coffs Harbour, where they were taken to the Human Rights Commission because a person in a wheelchair wasn't able to gain entry. And the Human Rights Commission then ended up in the federal court, and the federal court ruled that the cinema had to be made accessible in 12 years. So they gave them 12 years to make the cinema accessible. After that, it just degenerated into a joke. And frankly, it was the Labor government that pushed for implementing accessibility in government services by 2014, and then there was a change of government. And this happens all over the world, where one government is replaced by another that has a different set of priorities, and accessibility ends up being on the back burner. And that's exactly what's happened in Australia, and it won't change until governments implement accessibility themselves.
Ross, your feelings?
Exactly what Ricky says, where accessibility is under-resourced in the government. There's often pockets of individuals with expertise, but as there's no longer a central agency managing a government digital services, it's left up to individuals to push it as much as they can. And I found with my experience in a government, it's people appreciate it, people value it, but people don't implement it. So it's often that awkward point of everyone acknowledging that we need to be accessible, but there might be time, a budget, or resourcing, a whole list of reasons why they can't implement it. So should we reach a point of everyone in a government accepts that we need to be accessible, and we need to make things consistent, where at the moment there's often a lack of a consistency. Individual teams may have a deep accessibility knowledge, but in another department, not so much. So whilst there's this understanding of we need to be accessible, it's often that a thing mentioned but rarely implemented well. So until we reach that hard line in the sand with people and the community accepting that this isn't good enough, nothing will ever evolve, nothing will ever move past the bare minimum, which is all what we have at the moment, just a very bare minimum statement of we need to be accessible.
Andrew?
Someone I know who uses a screen reader has been squabbling with a vendor who's produced a form that he has to use in his work. It's at least 12 months, it might be 18 months, and he's been trying to get them to fix this wretched form. And just by the way, one of my bugbears is that HTML forms should be the easiest thing to get right, and almost no one does. Drives me mad. Anyway, eventually after, and as I forgot the time frame, but it's 12 or 18 months, he eventually contacted the Human Rights Commission, and they organised a conference with the vendor yesterday. And the guy from the company said, "Oh, this is the first we've known about this." My friend said, "Well, no, I've been complaining to your people." "Oh yeah, but it hasn't come to me." And it's just frustrating that something that really should be, well, firstly done properly in the first place, but secondly, should be quite easy to fix, for goodness sake. It's a bit of code, but that someone can be frustrated for over a year. And as Ricky touched on, the legislation now is such that if that vendor decided that they couldn't be bothered even meeting, then what are you going to do? If you're rich enough, you can go to the federal court, but most of us don't have that sort of money. So some of these things can be frustrating, partly because they shouldn't have gone wrong in the first place, and partly because they should be easy to fix. And we just seem to have this inertia about how why can't we just make this correction? On a brighter note, and I'll mention the company, I went to the JB Hi-Fi website a couple of years ago now, and they put one of those carousels on the front page, and every time it refreshed, it threw me back up the top of the page, and it just became impossible to use. So I dropped them a note and I explained the situation, and I went back to the site a few days later. It was fixed. I mean, some people can do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's some really good research around this as well. And we've got plenty of resources. And I will mention that one of the things around policies and understanding how to utilize the policies that we do have in Australia, OZeWAI is doing workshops. And I believe a couple of you guys are involved in that. So I should mention those. There'll be some upcoming workshops around accessibility policy. So I would highly encourage people to attend those. I want to get in one more question before I start wrapping up and talking about some of the things that we're going to hopefully be able to talk about in the future as well, and talk about some of the things OZeWAI is doing. My follow-up question to all of this around national transition strategy, because there are really two things. One is, you know, there are cases now in America that are being overturned because they are being seen as frivolous, where people are getting sued and judges are saying, nah, that's not really stopping you from doing what you need to do. So an overabundance of, you know, the 3,000 lawsuits that happen in the United States every year around website accessibility. But the other side of that is the skill set. And I think all of you actually touched on this at some point in what you said, is that not only do we have a lack of implementation of what should be best practice and just correct use, but we have a lack of knowledge, including inside government agencies, where this isn't taken up. As Ross, you pointed out earlier, that you might have one team that's fairly aware of accessibility, another team who's never heard of it. I was recently with a client who I've worked with for 8 years. 8 years I've worked with this client. It's a very big organization, and I met with a product owner who I'd never met before. They've been with the company for 10, and she didn't realize that accessibility was a thing, let alone that I'd been in the building every fortnight for 8 years. So, you know, getting the message out, it seems we're still doing a lot of education, and, you know, it's chicken and egg stuff. Do we get the laws before we have the skill set? I want to use that opportunity to mention that OZeWAI is workshopping some ideas around apprenticeship for accessibility professionals, digital accessibility professionals. And I think this is a future for not just what OZeWAI does, but for Australia, is to upskill in this area, because we do not have enough accessibility professionals in this country.
I suspect a big part of the problem is in the education of people who are going into the field of web design. You know, why isn't this, you know, it should be something that's pushed very heavily, you know, write proper code.
Absolutely. Well, interestingly enough, the question I want to end on is, and Andrew, you're going to go first, so have a listen. Do you think digital accessibility would be taken more seriously if we started training all Scrum Masters, Agile coaches about digital accessibility principles?
Yes, is the short answer, and not just principles, but again, it's yeah. If I sound like a crack record, we don't have records anymore much. Yeah, it is understanding what makes a good product. That's really what we want to get across to people. Yeah, don't write rubbish code and then try and fix it when someone complains. You know, have a process where you start off by building it properly in the first place. I keep thinking during this session, many years ago, someone made a comment in a meeting I was at. They said, if the physical environment, the buildings were built on the same sort of expertise as online material, the whole city would fall down. And I think that's what we've got to work towards, is getting some real rigor into what people are building.
I agree. Ross, is this an education piece, do you think, for Agile coaches and Scrum Masters and product owners?
It is, and it isn't, where obviously having more teams aware of accessibility is a good thing. But as Andrew touches upon. What it needs more is rigor with how to test, how to implement, and how to make sure what is produced is an acceptable baseline of accessibility. But what I also think is I'm not necessarily sure where developers should know about accessibility intimately, because if we view accessibility as like security, is there an expectation of a developer of being aware of all the security principles, or is it enough for them to just know, oh, we need to do accessibility well? If it's that, then there seems to be a case where they can know about it, they can understand it up to a point, but they then accept that they need to work in a tandem with accessibility experts, as opposed to assuming that once they're implementing accessibility, their job is done. So it's part educational piece, but also emphasizing that they need to work better with accessibility experts, recognizing that it's okay to not know everything about accessibility, but what is vitally important is that they know that they need to implement it.
I couldn't agree more. I think these are all really valid points. Ricky, Agile talks a lot about MVP, minimum viable product, and if there was a phrase I could get rid of in the world, that would be it. Is the problem MVP doesn't include accessibility?
I think it's part of it. I think it goes back further than that, and that is that it isn't embedded into a fundamental understanding of what's good design, what's functional development, and what's inclusive interactivity. And if you don't start with those planks as the basis of your approach to any job, then you're not going to end up with accessibility front of mind. And that's, that's again, to re-emphasize, that's not about an edge case for 10% of the population. It's making things accessible for everybody. And I mean, you can say that universal accessibility is a pipe dream, but, and grasping that as a target is the starting point for it. I think at the moment we are trapped in a kind of a cycle of assessment and remediation where we're forever fixing things. And that's not going to change until we change the basic planks of how we educate ourselves about how to build an accessible world, including the digital world.
Absolutely agree. Well, we have nearly wrapped up time. Firstly, before I get into OZeWAI news, I just want to thank all three of you, Andrew, Ross, Ricky. You've been fantastic and shared so much knowledge and really freely, and really appreciate it. I know not just the people in the room appreciate it, but I truly do. Being able to talk to you like this, we don't actually get that opportunity very often. So it's been really great for me as well. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I know that we're aiming, Bree, we're aiming to have more of this happen. So if this is something you like, if there are topics, I know we couldn't get to everyone's questions today. There are topics you think we should delve deeper into. I heard a few in there already that I think we could really get into the nitty gritty, some technical, some not. Let's do it. Let's get it organized. Please get some, we sent out the survey, Bree, with send your suggestions, please. Post in the survey so we know what ideas you want to have spoken about in depth, and next time invite friends along and we can have an even bigger and broader discussion. Bree, thank you for organizing. As always, Bree on the back end is doing so much work, so an official thank you from myself and the rest of the committee for the work that you put into OZeWAI. And Bree, are there any last minute announcements you'd like to make?
I would just like to say that please join and help us, develop this community more so that we can keep bringing you events like this, partnering with other in-person events. We don't necessarily have our own anymore, but we have partnered with, I think it's been about 5 or 6 events since we just made that decision, and it's actually mean that we've made better connections and networking, which has been wonderful. So please join OZeWAI, please support us, support the community, give back, be a part of the projects that we're running. That would be my wish, and it's been great to have you here. Thank you so much, and we'll get some other topics going for the next few months.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, especially to our panel.
Thank you all.
And Jock, go to bed.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.
Cheers all. Well
done all. That was great. Thank you,
That's good.
Mark. Thanks, Jock.
All right. Have you stopped
I'm just going
recording?
to stop. I'm going to stop